Okay. Well, hello, good morning and welcome to the Connected Places Catapult and this webinar on data for local resilience and recovery. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us. I'll start by asking my expert panel to introduce themselves. Nicola.
Hi, my name's Nikki Mallet. I'm the head of data analytics at Essex County Council, and I've also been setting up and kind of contributing our data efforts across our partners for the Essex Centre for Data Analytics.
Eddie.
Hi, I'm Eddie Copeland. I'm the Director of the London Office of Technology and Innovation, LOTI.
Sunayana.
Hi, I'm Sunayana. I work here in London at a small social enterprise called Resurgence. We specialize in the field of weather data communication, and our specific focus is urban spaces in developing communities.
And Isaac.
Hi, I'm Isaac Squires. I'm a data scientist here at Connected Places Catapult, and I work on data-related problems in placemaking, from air quality to autonomous vehicles and planning technology.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for joining. So how this is going to work is we're going to talk over some points about people's experiences in using data for dealing with major challenges, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A at the end. So if you'd like to send in any of your questions you have on the chat that you'd like to raise, please do while we're talking. So my point of view, I 7 years ago, I was lead on smart cities in the UK government. Things seem to start quite slowly, but I think in recent years, UK local public services have come an enormous way in using data to deliver better for citizens. And they've done a lot of it on their own with not a lot of outside help necessarily. And I think I've been very impressed in the last year or so. And then suddenly this happens, and here we are all sitting in our kitchens, and we're having to run everything around us in a very, very different way. And I think we've seen a lot of coverage, understandably, of the NHS, but it's also local government is having to take on an enormous burden to keep things going, and isn't necessarily getting a load of coverage, a load of attention for this, but this has created a lot of new challenges. So I'll start by asking Eddie, what in terms of what new data requirements or data gaps, what's been your experience and your colleagues in LOTI's experience during the pandemic?
We've been working closely with boroughs right across London as part of the crisis, and I guess their number one responsibility, certainly for data teams, is can we use data to quickly identify which groups, which individuals are vulnerable right now. And there were groups who were previously vulnerable, say people who were already known to adult and children's social care services, who were already within the system. But there's people who are now vulnerable either in different ways. Children who are in receipt of free school meals now need support at home with food poverty. And newly vulnerable groups, so potentially even quite affluent freelancers whose work has disappeared overnight. How are we getting support to them? And so I think a role of data teams has been, how do we pull together different data sets to get a more rounded view of an individual so that services can get out there and support them? And I think this has revealed those boroughs who've already got the infrastructure in place to pull together data from lots of different service areas, line of business systems, have been able to do that quite well. Others have found real challenges in trying to get access to the data they need. And one very specific example just to share, we've noticed that if a child in receipt of free school meals goes to school in a neighbouring borough, their own home council doesn't know that that's the case. And this is a key risk factor showing vulnerability. And so we've been working to try and quickly ensure data teams can get that so that they can model vulnerability, so that all of their colleagues can actually put out the support that's required. So that's been top of the agenda.
Thanks. Nikki?
Yeah, I guess very similar. Data has been extremely kind of valued in our organisation. There's a huge kind of hungry appetite to have kind of access to the identification of kind of vulnerable and extremely vulnerable citizens that we need to shield as part of our Operation Shield efforts. And we've really kind of used data and insight to help us monitor the situation of COVID as it's kind of unfolded. And we're really starting to think about how we're using data and insight and analytics to help us understand where there's kind of heightened risk of vulnerabilities, not just for those kind of traditional shielded groups, but for people that are likely to have a heightened risk due to social isolation, things like domestic abuse, things like mental health and kind of child protection issues that might be going on in homes. So there's the kind of three ways that we've been kind of using data across our organisation. Firstly, in terms of saving lives, so how do we share that across our health and social care partners and our district councils? The second is to support the most vulnerable in relation to kind of using analytics and so open source data to help us understand where those vulnerabilities exist. And thirdly, using that data to support recovery. So what does the kind of modelling of the kind of medium and longer term impacts to society and demand on public services look like? And I think that's kind of the phase that we're starting to be in now, after spending quite a lot of kind of the last 7 weeks dealing with a lot of data requests. Our team has dealt with about 100 requests for data over the last kind of 7 weeks, just in terms of the scale of that. And we've been processing about 700 files in the last 7 weeks, just of kind of incoming new data sets and outgoing data sets, in order to support that kind of data sharing across our partners to ensure that people have access to the right information at the right time for the right things.
And how have you, how's it been trying to get hold of data from external organisations? Has that been a new feature of this?
Yeah, so I think kind of we're a kind of two-tier authority in Essex, and it's always and still is a challenge to kind of share data with our districts and kind of boroughs. So for us, COVID has really risen up the importance of how we build relationships with other partners, and thinking about where demand is now presenting itself that's not in public sector services. So where they are, people are approaching helplines, domestic abuse helplines, where they're going to public kind of community support services. I think that this now presents itself as an opportunity that we need to connect much better with our kind of local voluntary organisations and some of those other kind of signposting services that are also dealing with demand might traditionally not come to kind of public services. And I think kind of data analytics has a role to play to think about the relationship between that demand and also how we work together to serve our citizens better, because actually people don't work across organisational boundaries, they work in places. So I think that we haven't really had those conversations today, but it definitely kind of brings a new opportunity to light that maybe wasn't presenting itself so high up on the agenda. I'm
going to take a slightly different tack. Sunayana, while everyone else is, unless you're actually an emergency planning professional, a lot of us probably haven't done a lot of this in the past, but your organisation is a bit different in that you work on planning for resilience very long term. And do you want to talk us a bit through what it is that Resilience does?
Yes, thank you, Ben. So let me just first give a little bit of background about what we do, where we work, and maybe then we can talk about how it's been affecting us in this COVID crisis. So I work, like I said, for a small social enterprise called Resurgence. While we are based in London, we operate in developing countries, specifically at the moment in Kenya and Tanzania. We've been working with the national weather agencies in these two countries and the communities who reside in informal settlements in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Now, informal settlements, I think across the world, is called with different terms. I think most often we call it slums. Like in my home country, India, we call it slums. What we do is we work with these two groups and multiple other stakeholders who are a part of this system to convert weather data into accessible understandable and usable data that can, usable information that residents in these informal settlements or slums can use to take protective actions. And like you said, Ben, this creates longer term resilience to climate change. So we've been working particularly in urban informal settlements because there are significant challenges that this community faces. I mean, first of all, there's just so many people. It's a highly densely packed like physical space. There are a lot of people who live in this area across the world, at least about 1 billion strong population in this category, and they are highly vulnerable. As Eddie and Nicola have already mentioned, even here in the UK, this COVID-19 crisis has come on top of existing vulnerabilities and exposure. It is even more so in urban informal settlements. Like for instance, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, where we are currently operating, the COVID-19 crisis which hit them around the second half of March coincided with their rainy season. And we have been preparing for 2 years now, building a communication system that's going to take, that carries weather forecasts and severe weather warnings to this community so that they're able to prepare for rain-triggered crises like flooding and say infections. So this crisis has come on top of already existing vulnerabilities. And this also stresses out the coping capacity of the people there. So yes, so that is the context that we function in. And in terms of this particular crisis, if I may, our need for the data that we were using has not changed. So we still require weather data, like I mentioned, because we're in the middle of the rain season. So we definitely still require that. And the other type of data that we had been using was information, like data on how information is shared within the community and just community dynamics, as in who is sharing to who, what kind of data, what form in the form in which data is shared, and how it is accessed. So these two types of data still remains a necessity, but this COVID-19 crisis, I think, has amplified the need for data on information sharing and community dynamics. And I think Eddie and Nicola, in their briefing, they touched upon that as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think that as we go ahead, and particularly as we go into the kind of lockdown release, which no one's really come up with a good term for it yet. I think I heard a German compound word that I couldn't pronounce, but we're going to have to work one out anyway. I think local public services are going to have to be involved in that communication role and that sort of understanding, what people's questions are about what they can and can't do and what can and can't reopen. Nikki, do you feel your local services are going to have to take on a new communication role in that respect?
Yeah, I think the kind of transparent agenda around how we're communicating with our residents, particularly around the use of data, actually is kind of something that we've been starting to explore. But if you think about the fact that people live lives where they're not conformed to kind of organisational boundaries, we do need to think about kind of the messages about, how we're using their data, how we're using their information, and actually what messages they need to know at what points in time in order to remain safe and kind of remain kind of socially distancing, but also kind of flagging to them what support is available to reduce demand on kind of public sector services and where they can go to get that additional help in relation to new features that they might be experiencing in relation to some of those heightened vulnerabilities. So I think that the council and kind of our partners have a real role to play in kind of communicating with our kind of public. And I think from my perspective, it's not just the kind of county council's responsibilities, it's the system. So I think a real kind of place-based approach to that communication to tailor it to kind of individual needs in the individual communities and also lining up for the support that's available and how we connect people to the right things is kind of a role that we have to play across the whole system in Essex, working with our partners to do that as well.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, in terms of resilience of your own services and you're reaching vulnerable citizens, Eddie, what kind of data do you not have that you'd like to get?
I think one issue that a lot of boroughs have flagged, and I think this is probably true of local authorities around the UK, is actually challenge getting things like deaths data, getting really timely and clearly in a very troubling circumstance, the volume of deaths has increased. It's actually quite a long lag time before local authorities know that. And I think that really affects their ability, A, to ensure families get the support they need, B, to make sure the resources they do are going exactly where they're needed. So this is a problem that we're trying to unpick alongside social finance, a consultancy at NMHCLG. That's definitely arisen. And I think just more broadly, we're realizing different local authorities have different access, different relationships with their various partners. Their ability to get their hands on the data they need is really variable. And this points to, and I think we'll come on to this conversation later, some of the more sort of foundation layers to make sure that it shouldn't be such a hodgepodge of who can get what. We need more consistent access to some of these. And I think a crisis really reveals what's needed, but deaths is one that's clearly arisen recently.
Nikki?
Yeah, I'd kind of, sorry, I'd echo that around, so kind of what we've still found challenging even through the kind of COVID crisis is health and social care data sharing. It just remains a challenge for us, which kind of is quite unusual when you think that now's the time, right, to kind of think about how we're sharing data across kind of social care and health, and yet it still seems quite kind of a kind of avenue that we still need to explore. And I think you're right, kind of we're now starting to think about the ongoing and sustainable way in which we have to meet the needs of a new group of residents in terms of the most extremely vulnerable. And whilst we have reacted and responded to the kind of emergency event, this is going to be something, you know, these residents are going to have needs that we're going to need to continue to support across our system for another year. And how do we do that in a much more coordinated way where we do have access to which organisations have made contact with these vulnerable residents in order to ensure that we're not over duplicating work that doesn't need to be taking place, where we know at the moment our health colleagues are contacting some of these people, we're contacting some of these people, social care is contacting the people. So kind of we want to be efficient in that process. And I think we need the solid foundations that the kind of Eddie is kind of starting to talk about in relation to supporting that.
Eddie, you're waving.
Well, just a follow-on point. So one of the other interesting trends I think we've seen as part of the crisis is councils moving some of their democratic functions online for the first time by necessity. And one of the opportunities I hope we see there is that the UK starts taking much more seriously the idea of innovating with digital democracy type tools. And the reason I say that in relation to data is as this situation evolves, it's not just us, you know, getting data points on individuals. Some of the qualitative data that citizens, their lived experience as the situation evolves, ensuring that is fed back into local authority decision making and service provision, I think is going to be really critical. So it's definitely a time for some much more imaginative attention on how we collect new forms of data, new forms of insight from communities themselves.
Thanks. And just to say to the audience, please do go to the Q&A if you want to put any questions. But actually, I'll put the same question to you. You know, what data sets do you think would help you get through this emergency best that you perhaps haven't got your hands on? So do share your views in the Q&A. Sunayana, what don't you have that would most help in the way of data sets for your work?
I think that's very very pertinent question for the communities that we work with. I think across the world, informal settlements and data related to informal settlements gets left behind. That creates a big challenge in terms of responding, first of all, to crisis, but also in terms of preparing the communities for future disasters. I think when we started our project in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, we required a range of data. Some of it was available and some of it we had to go out and gather ourselves. But I think what we found is because there is this gap in data, especially with informal settlements, it has created a space for community-led data creation and data platforms. So for example, Ushahidi is a really good example of a community-created data platform, and I believe it's being used in the UK now as well. I think one of the crowdsourcing sort of initiatives is hosted on that. What that points to is, I think also ties back to what Eddie just said. People in the community do have experiences, and that is also data point, and that needs to be fed back into the system. And we have, on the other hand, we have communities creating platforms themselves to be able to put this data and put themselves on the map, if I may say so. We are generally able to touch into that and use that kind of data. On the other hand, there's also in crisis situations, greater appetite for, I think, cross-sectoral data sharing, like Nicola and Eddie touched upon as well. So we are able to, if there is data that we don't, if we have the requirement for data that we don't already have, we're able to connect with partners in the sector and are able to share that kind of data. And ourselves, we're open to sharing data as well. I know that at sort of like a national, rather like a global level, I know that the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, is coordinating data sharing as well. So agencies that probably on a normal, like on a regular peacetime basis were not actually sharing, didn't have the capacity to share data, are now quickly ramping up to be able to share data with their neighbors and regional, actors, because there's a sense of we're all in this together.
Is anyone, Eddie, Nikki, I wonder if, do you know if anyone is using social media data to sort of track sentiment of citizens? I'm aware it's happening in other countries. I'm not aware of anyone doing it in the UK as yet.
So we were investigating whether or not we could kind of start to analyse hashtags around lockdown for as communications evolved, but we hadn't kind of completed any of that work, but it was kind of things that we wanted to do. And I do think that kind of rich source of kind of open data that's out there about kind of social media, not just Twitter, but kind of other feeds, is something that kind of public services probably haven't explored. And I think that's kind of an untapped potential, particularly where we do want to understand our views of residents in a kind of more real-time fashion than how we previously have done. So I think there's lots more opportunities to do things like that, and it's not something that we necessarily have the skill set to do. So I think kind of utilising capabilities that exist elsewhere and how we can form partnerships for enabling other organisations to help us do that, and then there are kind of some good opportunities that would be worth exploring.
Well, they do say that necessity is the mother of invention. So Eddie, what are you doing better because you've been forced to?
We're doing better. So, well, I think if we're looking for a silver lining from the crisis, stuff that I've been writing about for about the last 7 years, and I think many others in the sector have been calling for, is there's some plumbing that has needed to be fixed for a long time on data collaboration, right? In terms of the lack of data standards that make joining up data sets or consistent use in the UK of unique property reference numbers to match data at address level. We know that there's technology suppliers who charge local authorities to access their own data, like hindering data analysis from the start. We know that different local authorities, and this includes in London, have very different tools and approaches for information governance, looking at the legal, ethical, security rules around data sharing. All of these sum up to making it incredibly difficult, a really high bar for being able to share data. And I think in the short term with the crisis, and we've heard this from all the speakers, the balance of risk and reward shifts so massively that we have been able to share data really quite dramatically. And the last time I tried to do a data sharing agreement across London pre-COVID, it took 6 months. During COVID, sharing data on free school meals, IG colleagues across London did it in 3 days. So it is possible, but I think we have to take this opportunity to say, once and for all, let us not go back to those old ways of working. Let's put it right. Let's get contracts where we get access to our data. Let's find areas where we need data standards and really drive them home and embed them. When it comes to information governance, we've proven we can do it quickly. Let's put in some common processes so that we can do this rapidly where appropriate, where necessary. And I'm inclined to say if we don't do that now in the next couple of months, I'm not sure we ever will, but that feels like a major opportunity for something we could put right.
We've got a lot of good questions coming in, but there's also one just contribution from James Coombe, who picks up the same point about lived experience, that we need more timely and granular data about resident well-being and perception as we track the economic and social recovery. So, in a year's time, if you have managed to take advantage of the emergency, what would you like to be doing differently, Nikki?
Yeah, I think there's three kind of avenues of thought that we are wanting to pursue as part of the kind of opportunities that it's presented itself. I guess kind of, partnerships for us is more important than it ever has been. And we've established very, very quickly, a bit like Eddie was saying with the governance, new relationships with our kind of districts and boroughs that we've never done before. So I think we definitely want there to be kind of more ongoing conversations that enable us to have a place-based approach to kind of data management. So I think some of the things that we will start to explore over the next kind of few months is about how we have a data management integration system that's around a place, wrapped around a place, not just kind of a service area. So that kind of place-based approach to have a holistic view of our residents, their needs and their vulnerabilities, to help us deliver services quicker and more efficiently. I think connected to that, we have some kind of desires to strengthen our capabilities that exist across our system. So we know in ECC we're really fortunate to have a quite strong data analytics function where we are able to do things like risk stratification and kind of quite sophisticated statistical techniques. But we also know that our districts are not that fortunate and they don't have those capabilities. So how can we, as a kind of cross-system organisation, support them to grow and nurture some kind of data talent? And how can we create almost like a super district in an area of Essex that kind of demonstrates the value of how we can encourage other people to make better use of their data. So kind of creating an upskilling capacity within the system where we know it's kind of slightly weaker is something that we definitely hope to do off the back of this. And I think the kind of third area for us is around some dedicated capacity and resource to focus on health and social care analytics. I think that we've had lots of challenges as to why that's not happened to date in our system. And now is the time to really think about a deliberate, coordinated and focused acceleration of health and social care integration, and how we work with our CCGs and STPs to create some kind of integrated roles that we've started to be trialling out with Essex Police around kind of access to systems, enabling us to speed up analysis and exploration where there's issues that are emerging.
Thanks. Sunayana, any big ambitions for you?
Well, I think what's emerged quite strongly in this crisis is the issue of trust and the importance of trust in the system. So I think the way I think Nicola talked about partnerships and partnerships really being key in this in response to this crisis. If I go down level, like if I go into that, it's about trust as well. I think our focus in the last 2 years of operating in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam has been to build trust between the national weather agencies and residents of informal settlements, and also the various stakeholders who are involved in this system. And that's had good payoffs for us during this crisis. The reason I say that is because we work specifically on information, right? Converting data into accessible and usable information. Not only that, but we also worked with the residents and the national weather agencies to create a communication system to carry this information. And we're seeing that in the COVID-19 crisis, there is also an infodemic. There's just so much information out there from so many different sources. It's becoming it has become a challenge to sift through this information and identify what is factual, what's fact, and just what is usable really. And because of that, we're seeing that the people that we work with have automatically turned to the systems that they have high trust in. And thankfully, this is the communication system that we co-created with the community has their trust. And if I contrast that with my home country, India, or say many other countries, right? Like trust between the government and public is playing out in this crisis. in terms of, say, the public's adoption of government-led technology solutions, or even just public's trust and belief in what the government is putting out in terms of data and information. So I think one key takeaway is to keep building trust, whatever it is that we build, whether it's a communication system or it's a product, or regardless of who the partner is. I think trust is absolutely key, and that is what is going to carry us through different types of crises going forward. And
that must have particular challenges in informal settlements, in the informal economy. Oh yes, absolutely. If I can draw on what's happening in India at the moment, say what was absolutely unprecedented was the impact on this migrant crisis, migrant workers due to the lockdown. That was absolutely unprecedented. So when the lockdown came into effect, we saw a number of who we call migrant workers not being able to earn their daily wage, not having access to food and your basic necessities and even shelter. So they started walking hundreds of kilometers to go back to their homes because that was their safe space. And for them, it has become an issue of trust as well, because they, at this stage, they want trusted information from trusted sources, but they don't know who that trusted source is, because they're obviously they need to trust the government. I mean, the government would want them to trust the government and the information that the government is putting down, and trust that the government is doing what they can for them, but it has come at a very high cost. So I think, and this group of people who oftentimes live in informal settlements as well are the backbone of the economy. So even when you talk about recovery, which India is doing at the moment, how do you put a solid recovery plan in place when these migrant workers are either affected by COVID or are affected by hunger or are affected by just the issues that the lockdown has created for them? And similar things are playing out in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam as well. We've seen an increase in violence in Nairobi, for instance, and a lot of it does play out in your informal sector and informal settlement space. Thanks. Yeah, I mean the recovery is the next point, I guess. We were in the UK. We were. I'm not absolutely sure where devolution had got to. It's still, in train somewhere at different stages in different parts of the UK, and I think that's going to be very interesting because the government is very committed to more localized economic planning. We've always been a very centralized country in that respect. And indeed, all the regions were asked to produce local industrial strategies, and I think they were all in March. So just in time. But I think there's a question of whether government is going to be ready to do new approaches and use very localized planning, or if it's going to be so desperate to kickstart the economy, it will just sort of revert to something we've done before, more quantitative easing or whatever. I mean, Eddie, what do you see as the prospects for local economic growth planning for the recovery?
I think there's a really strong potential role for data in that, and I think prior to the COVID crisis, we were talking a lot around the potential of Internet of Things devices, deployed in the public realm, so on high streets, within parks, to give much more real-time data. And I think one thing we've noticed as part of the COVID crisis period is a real public recognition that some of the static data reports that organizations rely on are simply not good enough. So I'd expect to see much more requirement for real-time data. And I think that could well translate into how we move from high street renewal to high street survival. And I think as clearly for the first time, we've been trying to distribute money out to local businesses to keep them afloat, which has been quite a novel experience. And I think there's whole rethinking of things like business rates. And it could be that we start to use data in a much more dynamic way to say, do you tie business rates to footfall statistics, which you could pull from, say, mobile phone operators, or from from the Google and Apples of this world,
Yeah.
and start, how do we design policy informed by data that gives us a sense of what's happening? And the final part of that, I guess, is already we notice certainly GLA, so sort of as city government in London, trying to assess London's busyness. So looking at TfL data to assess use of transport networks, trying to pull other data sources to know how much a high street's being used, public spaces being used, parks being used, as indicators of how well, and this will become increasingly important to monitor the health of that recovery. So I think there is prospects, and I think real-time data, more dynamic data, will be vitally important to plan well and to recover well financially as well as socially.
Thanks. Nikki?
Yeah, I think kind of open data added to that as well. So we've tried to be quite open and transparent about the work that we've done during the kind of last 7 weeks, kind of blogging about that on our Insight blog, and try to make kind of tools available that is a safe way of sharing kind of insight to certainly our districts about kind of vulnerable groups and kind of where they're located in terms of hotspot mapping. And I think kind of making more of that data open and accessible for other people and our partners and kind of other organisations to help us analyse and to support more of that longer term kind of modelling about the future and future scenarios would be really, really helpful. And I guess for us, we are starting to think about that kind of longer term kind of modelling around the kind of not just demands on public services, but also kind of attitudes and behaviours and how that might start shifting. So the use of that kind of open data and other data avenues that we don't traditionally explore in terms of public sector kind of sources, I think is kind of really important to help us think about a two-way approach to kind of how we share some of that information with kind of businesses and other vehicles for delivery of the economic growth that will need to happen post-COVID.
Is there anything you'd really like to see from government to make data for properly devolved planning work, Eddie?
I think for now I'm inclined to say we've got what we need, and maybe there's policy changes that we need further down the line, but the crisis, if nothing else, as I've mentioned on some of those core bits of plumbing that after a decade of debate we've still not fixed. There's stuff that is within our control to put right, and we should just crack on and do it. And I think when we hit a hurdle further down the line, we then make that appeal. In the very short term, there's a known issue which we're also working on with colleagues across London and the consultancy Policy and Practice, which is, can central government offer more granular data on universal credit recipients to local authorities who are clearly at the coalface of looking after vulnerable people. At the moment, again, another sort of function that's been heavily centralised, where the insight is needed locally. That's not about devolution so much, but definitely the handing of that sort of the visibility, the control of data, and the insight related to it, making sure that's getting down to a local level so that we spot vulnerable people before they end up in crisis, would definitely be on that list. But there's plenty more we can do without policy changes.
Thanks. Nikki, are you managing to hire in and hang on to the data skills you need in this environment?
Yeah, so I think we've done a lot of work in Essex and with the Essex Centre for Data Analytics in terms of how we upskill some of our traditional analysts in public sector to have capabilities that are slightly more about kind of understanding machine learning and kind of different statistical techniques. And the University of Essex for us have been a really key partner in kind of upskilling our kind of data analysts into kind of the data science profession. And kind of they've been working with us around specific training courses. We've also had kind of people from the university aligned to some of our projects, specifically for ECTA, where we are data sharing. So they can really be involved in some kind of early conversations about scoping and ensuring that we have the right solutions and the right methods applied to kind of the problem as we get hold of information and data. So kind of working with the university for us has been really beneficial around how we retain talent and also how we kind of upskill. And we've also found that we've been able to get in new talent into our organisation of people that are coming from the university that have the right skill sets and have been through kind of different kind of qualifications to what some of our existing long-standing members of the team have. So we're actually doing a really good job in terms of creating new roles into our team that are much more specialised about data science and data visualisation and storytelling. And kind of we're doing a great job in terms of bringing in new talent in terms of junior analyst roles into our team that have some of those skills and maybe not the experience of public sector working, which is, the problem isn't all tied up in a nice little bow. You have to kind of understand how you build relationships with your customers, how you help them to ask the right questions, which is part and parcel of our role. And I think that we give the kind of junior analysts a good bedding in experience about how to do that and how to work with more senior members of the team to kind of gain some of that public sector experience. So I think kind of utilising the university's role to help us to attract some of that, but also to upskill our existing workforce has been a really good kind of two-way arrangement that's enabled us to actually really flourish and thrive in relation to capabilities that we've kind of achieved to date, and hopefully continue to achieve as we move forward.
Isaac, I don't know if you want to say anything about the Catapult's data science fellowships before you go on to the Q&A.
Yeah, so at the Catapult here, we've been working with some local authorities. We've been working with Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Camden, and just kicking off with something with Essex as well. And we've been working with putting data scientists into local authorities and working with them and kind of scoping out these new problems that, local authorities have access to a lot of data and often don't have the skills. And we talked about how, Nikki talks about how you're kind of working on upskilling people in existing roles and finding out that there's these new roles that could exist within local authorities. And we've been kind of helping to give the technical support and, provide the help with these new skills and these new sort of emerging areas. And one actually very relevant one is we worked with Buckinghamshire to do a project on social isolation and using new data that hadn't previously been pulled together from across the council and looking at social isolation, which actually, in this time is a super relevant thing to be looking at. And it just shows that, there's a lot of power and a lot of opportunity at the moment available to local authorities if they bring in these new skills.
Great. Shall we go over some questions?
Yeah, we've had loads and loads and loads of questions, and we've touched upon some of them in the conversation, but there are some really good ones in here. I think a good one to start with is from Gary Todd, and he's said here that more than 10% of childcare providers are stating that they won't reopen post-lockdown. And he said this will obviously have an impact on employment and slow recovery. And at the moment, that a lot of the information about childcare is just in like PDF lists. It's not very machine readable. How should the local authorities collaborate with each other, and also, interestingly, with innovative startups to quickly address this shortfall in the technology and the data that is currently available? I think we should send that one over to Nikki.
I guess quite interesting question around kind of the information being in PDFs. I think we have heard from the University of Essex kind of how we are able to extract information that's kind of in PDFs and create kind of some kind of new techniques that help us to make unstructured data structured. So I think that's an interesting kind of avenue to explore, particularly if there's information that is held in kind of non-reportable kind of traditions, because I think there's lots of kind of techniques that can be applied to helping us create that kind of unstructure into structure for analysis. And I think, local authorities do have a role to play in terms of collaborating with providers and the education sector around modelling impacts to kind of provision and kind of lack of provision, and then the impact that has to play on kind of the outcomes of kind of children in their later life if kind of capacity is still not available, or kind of people aren't attending where they are able to take advantage of kind of settings that when they start to reopen. So I think kind of there's some really interesting avenues to explore, particularly about kind of the education and childcare kind of setting for both the here and now. So kind of preparing the future and that kind of best start in life for a child, and the kind of wider impacts that will have if we don't set the scene and start that well post-COVID.
Great. I think there's a couple of questions here that I'm going to try and combine into one. And we touched upon this idea of collecting more experiential, qualitative information and data from residents post lockdown, and in the response, trying to understand the sentiment of a population, which Ben talked about social media data, but there's obviously lots of other ways of kind of collecting the sentiment of a population. And we also talked about new data infrastructure that's needed. So, IoT devices, big companies like Apple, and getting this kind of live dynamic stream of data. But how do we make sure that there is an infrastructure for collecting the more qualitative and experiential data post-lockdown? Eddie?
It's a really good question, and I think that there's a risk, I guess, coming out of a crisis that we do what we've often our reaction in the past. You find a problem and then you just try and pull together every single data set you can to try and solve it. And I'd be a strong advocate for saying we need to double down on, certainly at LOTI, we use an outcomes-based methodology where you start with the end in mind, like what is it we're trying to do? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Who could do what differently if they had better information? And if you start with that lens and then say, right, what's your data product? What do we need to see on a screen? What's the insight? What's the report? What's the what is it that drives that new action? We can then have a sensible conversation around the data. And as I said, there's some really basic data we've realized we haven't been giving access to, and the bog standard data sets held by local authorities where we could use that. We know there's corporate data sets, the work of the London Data Commission at the moment, trying to say, how do we get data from retailers, network operators, utilities companies that could enrich our vision, but also, where are we lacking that insight? And we've seen, cities like Jakarta use Twitter analysis to, for flooding crises and to make sure that enriches government data and is disseminated out to the community. There may well be that opportunity here, but it should be done with the end in mind. Otherwise, we could spend a lot of time and energy trying to collect data, trying to raise people's expectations and get them to engage without then delivering on it. And I think that's a risk we need to be mindful of.
Nikki, do you have anything to add about how you post-lockdown can start to gauge the kind of more experiential attitudes of the population to the response?
I guess I echo Eddie's sentiment about kind of starting with the end in mind. So in Essex, we've really embedded the Nesta 4-step. That's kind of become a normal way of working when kind of problems are put to us. And I think that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to kind of that as a kind of problem. And I've heard from kind of other authorities that have kind of very quickly in COVID rushed into just responding and reacting to kind of sharing data because we need to know that information, and actually that they're now starting to have to unpick why they've shared, what they're doing with it, what the action is that's going to be taken. And I do kind of really echo Eddie's sentiment around if you're really clear about what you think you can do the other end, then you can work back with, well, what do you need to know to inform that action? And so starting with that kind of this is what we'd like to be able to influence or change as a result will then help you think about the right information that is available, whether that is data, whether that's unstructured or structured, whether that's kind of open source or kind of opinions and kind of experiences. Sometimes a data solution isn't the solution at all. So kind of I think kind of a better understanding of the problem and the intended action is probably a better place to start rather than rushing to kind of putting it all into one magic pot, because it's not a magic solution. It will still probably just give you just as many questions as you did when you started, if you start layering all those kind of intelligence out there with no kind of aim or kind of common goal in mind.
Thanks. This is a question from Nigel Kirby, and it relates to information sharing and the kind of attitudes to information sharing and the new techniques that we've found, especially whilst trying to maintain GDPR compliance. He says that in light of emerging COVID-19 data sharing challenges, is this an opportunity coupled with Brexit to revise the GDPR and incorporate an emergency circumstances clause to enable the sharing of data across stakeholders, but with an independent oversight / ethics authority. Now, I know that Nikki, you have on the Essex website have a tab sharing how your data sharing policy has changed and how you're looking at the kind of public interest and public health legal basis. How do you think we need, is there any kind of flexibility that you think is needed beyond that in GDPR?
I mean, I think it is an opportunity to rethink it. And hello, Nigel. Yeah, because obviously we know each other from university. And I think that we, as in the County Council, from a data perspective, have never been wholly aligned to kind of the preparations for kind of incident and emergency planning, which I know sounds a little bit odd. But I think that this is really helps us to understand what the kind of emergency protocols are around ISPs that are already in place across public services, specifically for emergency management, and actually the kind of wealth of partners already signed up to that. We need a much better understanding about kind of what's required as a permanent solution to information sharing where those incidences occur. And I think rethinking about GDPR in that light and being clear and communicating with our residents about what we're doing and why, I think is really important. So I do think COVID has enabled us to rethink that. And whilst there is still kind of frameworks in place that we have to comply to, and obviously be really ethical and mindful about the ethical choices we make around that, I do think we've shown that in emergency and incident management events, you can share safely data with the intended audience allowing them to take the right action. So I think it's kind of tracking through different scenarios and different emergency events and how we can rethink GDPR in relation to it being an enabler for some of these kind of new activities to take place, and how we do that with a wider stream of partners, including our health colleagues and districts in response to those incidents.
Eddie, I know that you've talked a lot about how the information sharing has sped up and become a lot more efficient during COVID. Do you think that that's kind of evidence that the framework we have is good and robust and it's more a kind of process issue?
I certainly don't think we need any changes to GDPR in that, public sector organisations have, in many cases, very clear statutory responsibilities to protect vulnerable people. People are particularly vulnerable right now, and that is why for things like children in receipt of free school meals, it's been very easy to make sure that we can put that data sharing arrangement in place. It is entirely within GDPR. I think there's often a misconception the only way of sharing through GDPR is through explicit consent, and in the public sector, there are other options where you've got the statutory responsibility where you must intervene to support a vulnerable person. So I'm not aware at the moment of any case where GDPR has been an issue. I think it is about those processes. I think, again, working within our current paradigm, there's a lot that we can do. And in some ways, there's stuff we can't do, and it's right that we can't. We still need to ensure that high level of trust, as we heard earlier in the conversation, and to ensure that that's maintained. GDPR is pretty key to that.
Thanks. I wanted actually to just come back to Sunayana for a moment on the this question of local economic recovery from emergencies and crisis or natural weather events. And I think perhaps all this is a bit new to us, but you've perhaps got longer term experience. I mean, do you have good examples of sort of what works in using data to stimulate local economic recovery?
Thanks, Ben. And I'll try my best to answer it as much as I can, although I might not be the best person to answer this particular economic recovery question. But I think what we've been talking about is having a strong data set on multi-hazard vulnerability. These kind of crises, especially crises of this scale, are an opportunity for transformative change. And in Africa, we're hearing more and more from various disaster risk reduction agencies that multi-hazard vulnerability data needs to be baked into economic recovery at this stage itself, because when a hazard when a hazard occurs, it comes on top of existing vulnerabilities, and then that just amplifies the vulnerability more and more, unless individuals or communities have a very strong coping mechanism in place. So I think in this circumstance, for instance, like I said, COVID-19 this crisis is coming on top of rain-related hazards, but it is also perpetuating and amplifying the food insecurity that already has taken hold in the region, and not having your access to daily livelihoods, because a lot of people in informal settlements are daily wage workers or laborers, or hawkers, or like road sellers, who depend on being out there and earning on a day-to-day basis. Their livelihood is taking a significant hit, as it is everywhere in the world. But for them, that's reducing their capacity to cope with disasters. So I think, yeah, having multi-hazard vulnerability data baked into the recovery process, so that economic recovery process, or social recovery process needs to have the kind of mechanisms and coping mechanisms in place to avoid the economic capability taking a further hit when the next crisis occurs. And next crisis will occur. It'll just, the nature of the crisis will be different.
Thanks.
Thanks. I think this is probably our last question we have time for before Ben wraps up, and it's an interesting one. It's from James Lewis. We talked a lot about what sort of data sets have been exposed that we need now, and that we in the future would like to have access to, but we also surely have reflected on the data sets that we have that are no longer useful. Eddie, has there been any sort of exposure on the data that we have that maybe we should stop collecting and maybe we should leave in the past? Eddie?
Question that been top of mind in recent. Sorry, am I losing you? It's a good question. It hasn't come up, but I think it's definitely worth diving into, perhaps a few weeks from now. And I think a lot of local authorities now trying to think about what do they remove after this, what do they restore, what do they reinvent, what do they try and reinforce. So those sort of different labels emerging. And it's right that as we try and do new and more ambitious things, there should be some things that we clear and let go. And I think, the whole data agenda we've seen across local government in the last few years is a shift to action-orientated data analysis, where you analysing data for the purpose of doing some new and innovative things. Often that is not the reason that that data was collected, which was, previously for record keeping, good record management. And I think as we see that evolution from just capturing data to acting on data, we will see that shift. We should let go of some stuff. I'd suggest the crisis period itself is probably not the time when we'll ask it. We should ask it in a few months.
Just to kind of add to that, I guess that obviously lots of information is collected by different organisations for statutory purposes and reporting back up to kind of government, as well as local monitoring for kind of case management and kind of effective kind of knowing if the organisation is doing what it needs to be doing in a safe and secure way. But I think there's also a lot of duplication of effort between different kind of organisations, and the more we can think about a place-based approach to kind of data that's required versus kind of where there's kind of duplication and overlap between multiple agencies collecting the same information. Just as an example, I guess, around the kind of extremely vulnerable groups, you could answer that question one of 5 different ways from kind of different organisations' perspective. And I just think that we need to think a little bit more smarter about kind of removing some of that duplication and kind of, avoiding residents repeating the same information to multiple professions kind of 3 or 4 times, which isn't something that kind of anyone wants to do anyway. So I think that I don't know what the kind of specifics are, but I know there's a lot of duplication that could be rethought about post-COVID.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone. I'm going to finish by reading out a comment from Graham that so far there's been a lack of joining up on national local government data in the pandemic response. Central government has had a place blind approach and which hasn't recognised the different infection rates. So Orkney had the same lockdown as Orpington. And he hopes that the recovery will bring in more local government involvement and more sensitivity to place. I think we've seen that with the care homes and sector-specific responses. I think that's a good note to end on. Thanks very much for joining us. Please do join us again next week for radical innovation for places. Is the pandemic actually going to give us a great opportunity? So hopefully come along next week. Thanks very much for joining us, and thank you very much to our panel. I normally ask everyone to applaud, but it didn't seem to work quite this way. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.